Okay, here's the problem. Volvo V70 2006, juddering at 50-60 miles an hour, noticeably pulling slightly to the right. Were this at a higher speed, sort of 60-70, then I would assume a wheel weight had gone. That didn't appear to be the case because the problem was 40-50 miles an hour and was squealing a bit at lower speeds. So we took it into the shop, we took the right front wheel off. We noted that the wheel studs were quite hot, which certainly shouldn't be, they should be warm maybe. So we took the wheel off, we checked it, it was true, and it was spot on for balance. But then it became apparent that the caliper was probably the problem. The caliper was obviously sticking and would need to be freed up or replaced, or possibly the disc and certainly the pads as well would need to be replaced. So let's start that process. So perhaps with hindsight, the amount of brake dust is a bit of a giveaway. I'm not a particularly heavy user of the brakes. So up on trolley jack, axle stand as well, placed on the jacking point. The trolley jack is on a very strong chassis point. There's another axle stand, and again in an equally strong reinforced point. And you may note that the wheel is only just off the ground. It's much easier for putting them back on if you haven't got to lift it so high. So now we'll get on, take the wheel off and see what it looks like in there. Well, here we are. Here's the culprit. Worth mentioning, in taking the wheel off, just remember, mark or take a photo of the position that the wheel is in. Then at least if it is in balance, it'll go back in balance. You can see, I think, it's not in very good shape. I've got on order a new disc, caliper and pads, but we'll start to take it apart and have a good look at the problem, see if we can repair any of it or whether it's all got to be replaced. So we're in the process of pulling the pins out of the caliper so we can drop the pads to have a look at them, and then we'll get on with removing the caliper, putting it to one side. We'll hang it from the spring for the time being while we do the inspection. We don't want to disconnect it completely, and then we'll do a very close inspection of the disc. But it certainly looks to me at this stage like the new disc will be wanted, and probably the new caliper as well. Now the top pin is quite firmly stuck. That's not particularly unusual. You see the wrench is in position. It's got a 45 Torx on it. If it's sticking, we're not going to bash it too hard with the hammer. We will need to shock it slightly. So in this case, if any article, a rubber camping hammer, dirt cheap to buy and just about the right amount of persuasion. Well, progress so far. Still unsure about the disc itself, but at the moment the caliper is not freeing, so I can't get the pads out. I've drawn both of the pins out of the back, and still the pads won't free, so the caliper will have to come off. I'm going to take it off completely. There's two 15mm bolts that hold the inner part of that in place. They're usually pretty well gummed in if it hasn't been shifted for a very long time, so they might want a little bit of a tap, but don't get too carried away and make sure you use a spanner which fits perfectly, otherwise they will be shouldered, and believe me, that you don't want. That's going to cause such a lot of grief. So make sure you've got a spanner on a socket that fits perfectly. We've now got the outer half of the caliper off. It was well stuck on there, and we're temporarily hanging it from a cable tie. I don't want to put too much strain on the hose that feeds it, so I've cable tied it to the spring. It's just out of the way and out of the working space, but it's fairly clear that it's stuck. It might overhaul, it might not, until I finally detach it and put it on the bench. I wouldn't be sure. A fairly common sticking point. The bottom bolt holding the inner part of the caliper is pretty well stuck, so we'll give it a good soaking in one of those proprietary things like WD-40 or Plus Gas, or there's loads of them on the market now. Give it a good soaking, make sure it's got exactly the right fit of spanner and or socket, and give it a bit of a tap, and hopefully it will free itself. Well, I think we've decided to leave the disc in place. It looks rather worse than it actually is, and in just running the back of your nail across it, there's very light corrugation, so it really hasn't sustained much damage. Not sufficient damage, I think, to be worth changing. That's my view. Others might see it differently, but I think I'm going to leave this one. Well, here's the point at which we stop. I've just left the caliper laying there for the moment. You'll note the hose is clamped. I've protected the jaws of the mini mole grips so as not to damage the hose. We should lose the minimum amount of fluid, I hope. And at this point we've got to stop because the caliper hasn't arrived yet. It's due later this afternoon, so the story will resume then. So we decided after all that we would replace the disc, so you see me in the process of doing so. I've put two wheel nuts in. There's obviously only one locating bolt, which is just there, but before doing that up too tight, I want to make sure that things are all lined up, so I'm going to put 2 or 3 of the wheel bolts back in just loosely, just so that make sure everything is in place before we tighten anything up. Then we can put the caliper on. I know it seems a bit belt and braces, but when you come to refit the wheel later and the wheel studs all line up correctly first time, you'll be glad you spent a moment or two doing this. Everything fits for size. I'm just going to put the iron and the caliper carrier in place. You probably see that I've just located it with one bolt for the moment. That's just a bit less fiddly that way, because I need to do the top bolt and I need to put some thread seal on that, and then I'll put the bottom bolt in, ditto with the thread seal. The disc is now on and tightened up. I've taken the bolts out now because I don't need them for locating bolts anymore, and I've now got the caliper carrier on and the iron behind it, and made sure that's all nice and tight and secure. So, new caliper. You might note that I've slipped the 2 retaining bolts in just a little. It's sometimes easier to do it that way than put them in afresh later. And I've copper slipped the back of the inner pad and pop that into place in the piston. Now we just need to start to assemble it, so we'll do it a bit at a time. But first, I've still got to disconnect the old one. The caliper and both pads all loosely in place. Not too much point tightening them up yet, because it looks like I'm going to need to replace the brake hose after all. There's some damage to it, which means it probably wouldn't pass its next MOT, so I might as well, having got this far, send off for one of those and replace that as well. Well, this is the point at which I like to really check and make sure that everything is lined up and bolted up nice and tight. I haven't done, as you'll see, the brake hose connection yet. At this moment in time I'm waiting for the brake hose to arrive, so we'll be doing that a little bit later. And we've got to refit the spring. These are always a bit fiddly, unless you've got the right device for the job, which is very simple. one spring and one hook, and the hook's twisted. You can buy these quite easily, there's just a few quid, and they'll save you an awful lot of skin knuckles, bad language, and wasting time. So spring now in place, 2 or 3 minutes with the hook. It's otherwise often a real pain of a job. Okay, just about there now. As you can see, lost a bit of fluid, got a bit messy, but that'll clean up. The new hose in place, calipers in place, spring. I've yet to just clean off the disc, which I will do before I fit the wheel. But I think we're just about there, and I don't think you'll need me to show you how to fit the wheel. If you've got this far, you certainly know how to do that anyway. Brake hose fiddly. I found I had to take, to get the thing to line up right, which is something that is checked. I had to take the caliper off and wind the caliper onto the hose, allowing for final tightening once the caliper was back in place. I found it quicker and easier to do that. So, wheel back on, clean up and check it thoroughly. We've bled the system with one of those one-man kits. Can't speak too highly of them, they're excellent. You just need to make sure you've got plenty of fluid to do it with, and I think the bleed took me 5-10 minutes. Well worth the purchase of. So we can get the wheel back on, get it all back together. Well, it's been a tricky job, but it's all done now. Like any job on the brakes, it needs to be carefully checked. I've also, for balance, replaced the disc and the pads on the other side so that we get even braking. But make sure everything is tightened up properly, and then we'll take it out on the road for a quick test drive. Now we've got to the end. Total cost of bits about 100 quid for both sides. That's taken me about 2 days, but then again that would be 700 or 800 quid in a garage, so well worth doing, I think, and my time is a bit cheaper than that. All done.